February 20th, 1996. Cleveland, Ohio. The Cavaliers are hosting the Chicago Bulls, the team that will finish this season with 72 wins, the greatest regular season record in NBA history. Michael Jordan is on the floor. Scottie Pippen is on the floor. Dennis Rodman is on the floor. And somewhere on the Cleveland bench, waiting for minutes that barely exist anymore, sits a 24-year-old guard named Harold Miner. He gets into the game. 5 minutes. 5 minutes of running, defending, existing inside an NBA arena for what will be the very last time. He does not score. He does not grab a rebound. He does not record an assist. The Bulls win by 26 points, and when the final buzzer sounds, Harold Miner walks off the court and into permanent obscurity. There is no farewell ceremony, no press conference, no emotional interview in the tunnel. The man once called Baby Jordan, the most electrifying nickname a young basketball player could ever receive, simply vanishes. Cleveland will waive him shortly after, having used him in only 19 games that entire season. No other team will sign him. His NBA career is over. 4 seasons, 9 points per game, 2.2 rebounds, 1.2 assists. Those are the career numbers of a player who was once named college basketball's Player of the Year by Sports Illustrated. A player chosen 12th overall in one of the most talented NBA drafts ever assembled. A player who won the NBA Slam Dunk contest not once, but twice. A player who was compared, from the time he was a teenager, to the greatest basketball player who ever lived. How does that happen? How does a man with that resume, that talent, that label, disappear before his 26th birthday? Was it his knees, which had been quietly deteriorating for years? Was it coaching staffs that never believed in him? Was it the cruel mathematics of an NBA roster that had no room for a highlight reel without a complete game? Or was it something simpler and more devastating than all of that? A nickname? 2 words that sounded like a blessing when he was 17 and became a sentence he could never escape. But to understand how Harold Miner ended up on that bench, watching Michael Jordan's Bulls dismantle his team in his final professional appearance, we need to go back to where it all started, to a city called Inglewood, California, where a teenager was doing things on a basketball court that people simply could not believe. Harold Miner was born on May 5, 1971, in Inglewood, California. If you know anything about basketball geography, you know what that means. Inglewood sits in the shadow of the Great Western Forum, the arena where Magic Johnson and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar built the Showtime Lakers dynasty. This is a city where basketball is not a hobby. It is a language. It is a culture. It is the way young men measure themselves against the world. And Harold Miner, from the moment he first stepped onto a court at Inglewood High School, measured up in ways that defied logic. He could fly. That was the simple version. The complicated version involved a vertical leap that seemed to belong to a different species, a hang time that made spectators hold their breath, and a finishing ability at the rim that turned ordinary fast breaks into events people talked about for weeks. By his junior year of high school, Miner was averaging 27 points per game. By his senior year, that number climbed to 28. And in one game, one single extraordinary performance, he put up 48 points and 17 rebounds. 48 and 17. In a high school game. That was the night the whispers became shouts. That was when the nickname cemented itself. Baby Jordan. Not just a good player, not just a local star. A young man who reminded people, scouts, coaches, journalists, fans in the bleachers, of Michael Jordan himself. The way he elevated, the way he hung in the air, the way the ball looked in his hands above the rim, like he was deciding what to do with it while gravity waited patiently below. It is a glorious thing, at 16 or 17, to be compared to the greatest player on the planet. Every gym you walk into, people already know your name. Every recruiter in America has your phone number. Every local newspaper wants to write the story of the kid from Inglewood who might be the next one. But there is a cost buried inside that comparison, and it is a cost no teenager can possibly understand. When they call you Baby Jordan, they are not just complimenting your talent. They are telling the world what they expect you to become. And if you do not become that, if you become anything less than a legend, then the same people who gave you that name will be the first to say you failed. Harold Miner did not know that yet. He was 17 years old, averaging 28 a game, and every college recruiter in America knew his name. But only one university would get him. And what happened there would turn Harold Miner from a local sensation into a national phenomenon and seal his fate. In 1989, Harold Miner enrolled at the University of Southern California. It was, in many ways, an unconventional basketball choice. USC was a football school. It had always been a football school. When people in Los Angeles thought about college basketball royalty, they thought about UCLA, the Bruins, John Wooden's dynasty, the banners hanging from Pauley Pavilion. USC basketball existed in that shadow, respected but rarely feared, competitive but rarely dominant. Harold Miner changed that equation the moment he put on the uniform. Over 3 seasons at USC, Miner became the most exciting player in the program's history. His dunking ability was the headliner, the thing that filled seats, sold highlight packages, and kept the Baby Jordan nickname alive on a national stage. But reducing Harold Miner to a dunker would be a mistake. He was a scorer, a competitor, a player who could carry an entire team on nights when nobody else could find the basket. He brought USC something the program had not had in years: relevance. Not UCLA-level relevance, perhaps, but genuine national attention. The kind of attention that makes recruits notice, the kind that makes television networks care. By his sophomore year, Miner was the face of Trojan basketball. By his junior year, the 1991-92 season, he was something more. He was one of the best college basketball players in the entire country, leading USC into the national conversation alongside programs with far deeper traditions and far bigger budgets. And the basketball world was watching. Not just the scouts, not just the NBA front offices already projecting where he might land in the draft. The media was watching too. And by the spring of 1992, Harold Miner wasn't just the best player at USC. According to one of the most respected sports publications in the world, he was the best college basketball player in America. And the names he beat out for that honor? You might not believe it. In his junior season, his final college season, Sports Illustrated named Harold Miner their College Basketball Player of the Year. Stop for a moment and consider what that means. This was not a fan vote. This was not a regional honor. This was the gold standard of American sports journalism, the magazine that shaped how an entire nation understood athletics, declaring that one player stood above every other college basketball player in the country. Now, consider the names he was chosen over. Christian Laettner, the Duke senior who would, in that very same tournament, hit one of the most famous shots in the history of the sport, a turnaround jumper against Kentucky that remains, 3 decades later, the definitive image of March Madness clutch performance. Laettner's Blue Devils won back-to-back national championships. He was the most decorated college player of his generation. Shaquille O'Neal, the 7'1", 300-pound force of nature at LSU, who would become, within a few years, the most physically dominant player the NBA had ever seen. a consensus All-American, a future league MVP, a future champion, a future Hall of Famer, Alonzo Mourning, Georgetown's anchor, a defensive terror, a player who would go on to become an NBA All-Star and win a championship of his own. Sports Illustrated looked at Leitner, looked at Shaq, looked at Mourning, and said, Harold Miner is better right now. That is an almost incomprehensible level of recognition. It told the basketball world that the kid from Inglewood, the one they called Baby Jordan, was not just hype. He was the real thing, the very best. But think about what that recognition also did. It took a nickname that was already impossibly heavy and added another 100 pounds. If you are the player of the year over Shaquille O'Neal, the expectations do not just rise, they become permanent. Every NBA general manager, every scout, every fan who reads that magazine now expects you to outperform those three men at the professional level too. Harold Miner was 20 years old. He had just received the highest individual honor in college basketball. The sky was supposed to be the limit. But before he could even think about the NBA draft, he had to survive the NCAA tournament. And what happened in Milwaukee would haunt him for the rest of his career. The 1992 NCAA tournament. Harold Miner and USC entered as the number 2 seed in the Midwest region. A 2 seed. That meant the selection committee believed the Trojans were among the 8 best teams in the country. That meant a real path to the Final Four. That meant Harold Miner had a legitimate chance to do something no USC basketball player had done in decades. Take the program deep into March and validate every word Sports Illustrated had written about him. The early rounds went according to plan. USC advanced. The brackets held. And then came the game that would define the end of Harold Miner's college career. Not with a triumph, but with a gut punch delivered at the buzzer. Georgia Tech. Not a powerhouse. Not a team anyone expected to end USC's season. But college basketball has never cared about expectations. And on that night in Milwaukee, the Yellow Jackets had a player named James Forrest who was about to make himself immortal. The game was tight. The final seconds ticked down, and James Forrest launched a three-pointer, a shot that seemed to hang in the air for an eternity, as if the basketball gods themselves were deciding whether Harold Miner's college story would end in glory or in heartbreak. The ball went in. Buzzer beater. Georgia Tech wins. USC is eliminated. The moment would become known as the Miracle in Milwaukee, a phrase that lives in NCAA tournament lore to this day. For Georgia Tech and James Forrest, it was the highlight of a lifetime. For Harold Miner, it was the cruelest possible ending to the greatest chapter of his basketball life. Just like that, his college career was over. 3 seasons at USC, a Player of the Year award, a number 2 seed, and then a buzzer beater, a handshake line, and a locker room where everything he had built came to a sudden, irreversible stop. But Harold Miner had no time to mourn, because the 1992 NBA draft was approaching, and one of the most loaded draft classes in basketball history was about to determine his professional future. The question was no longer whether he would be drafted. The question was where, and whether any franchise could give Baby Jordan what he needed to survive the weight of his own name. The 1992 NBA draft is remembered today as one of the deepest talent pools in the history of professional basketball. Shaquille O'Neal went first overall to the Orlando Magic, the giant from LSU who would reshape the league in his own image. Alonzo Mourning went second to the Charlotte Hornets. After that, the board was stacked. Latrell Sprewell, Tom Gugliotta, Walt Williams, LaFonso Ellis. Name after name after name. Future starters and all-stars cascading through the first round like dominoes. And at pick number 12, The Miami Heat called Harold Miner's name. Miami in 1992 was not the franchise it would later become. There were no championship banners, no legacy of greatness. The Heat were just 4 years old, an expansion team still searching for an identity, still trying to convince South Florida that professional basketball mattered in a city that worshipped the Dolphins and the Hurricanes. Drafting Baby Jordan was supposed to be a statement, a young, electric, marketable star to build around, a player whose highlights could sell tickets and whose nickname alone could generate back-page headlines. But think about the position this created. The men Miner had been ranked above by Sports Illustrated. O'Neal, Mourning, Laettner all went to franchises that immediately built around them. Shaq became Orlando's centerpiece overnight. Mourning was Charlotte's franchise player from day one. Laettner stepped into a veteran Minnesota roster that needed scoring. These were players who received the ball, the minutes, and the organizational commitment from the moment they arrived. Harold Miner landed in Miami at pick 12. Not first, not second, 12th. High enough to carry enormous expectations. Low enough that the franchise did not feel obligated to hand him the keys. It was a dangerous middle ground, too famous to develop quietly, too unproven to demand playing time. And the coaching staff waiting for him had very different plans than the ones he had imagined. 12th pick. Miami Heat. A young franchise, a young player, and the most dangerous nickname in basketball hanging around his neck. But here is where the story takes its first truly troubling turn. Because the man running that team's rotation had no intention of giving Harold Miner the minutes he needed to grow. Kevin Loughery was the head coach of the Miami Heat when Harold Miner arrived as a rookie in the fall of 1992. Loughery was an experienced NBA coach, a man who had been around professional basketball for decades and who had his own ideas about how to build a team, develop young players, and distribute minutes. Those ideas, as Harold Miner would quickly discover, did not include featuring a 21-year-old lottery pick in the rotation. From the very beginning, Miner's playing time was limited, not occasionally limited, not situationally limited, consistently, stubbornly limited. The kind of restricted role that tells a young player, night after night, that his coach does not trust him. And this is where the paradox becomes almost unbearable. The Miami Heat used a lottery pick on Harold Miner. They brought him into the franchise knowing exactly who he was: a spectacular athlete, an explosive scorer, a dunker whose highlight reel could fill an arena. The nickname was part of the package. The expectations were part of the deal. And then, having made that investment, the coaching staff essentially shelved him. Why? The answers are complicated and, to this day, not fully explained. The NBA in the early 90s was a physical half-court league that valued defense, toughness, and veteran reliability. Miner was electric in the open court, devastating in transition, and breathtaking above the rim. But professional basketball is played mostly in the half-court, and the skills that made him a college phenomenon, the aerial artistry, the one-on-one scoring bursts, did not automatically translate into a coach's trust during a close game in the fourth quarter. Was Loughery seeing something the public was not? Defensive liabilities? An inability to run the offense? Or was this simply a coaching failure? A veteran coach unwilling to invest patience in a young player who needed reps, needed mistakes, needed the freedom to struggle and improve? We may never know the full answer. What we know is the result. A 12th overall pick, the reigning college player of the year, according to Sports Illustrated, was watching large stretches of NBA games from the bench. The development that should have been happening, the on-court education that turns raw talent into a complete professional, was being denied, one empty night at a time. Limited minutes, a coach who did not seem to believe in him. But even as his NBA playing time was being rationed, Harold Miner found another stage, a stage where he could remind the entire basketball world exactly what he was capable of. And in February of 1993, he did exactly that. In the early 1990s, the NBA Slam Dunk Contest was not a sideshow. It was an event. Millions of viewers tuned in during All-Star Weekend specifically to watch the dunk contest, to see which player could defy gravity most spectacularly, which athlete could turn a 10-foot rim into a canvas for something no one had ever seen before. Michael Jordan had won it. Dominique Wilkins had made it legendary. It was the one night of the year where pure athleticism, creativity, and showmanship mattered more than wins, losses, or coaching rotations. In 1993, Harold Miner, a rookie who was barely playing for his own team, entered the contest and won it. Let that sink in. A first-year player who could not crack a consistent rotation in Miami walked onto the biggest individual stage in basketball and proved beyond any doubt that his talent was real. The dunks were ferocious. The elevation was absurd. The crowd erupted, and for one night, the Baby Jordan nickname did not feel like a burden. It felt like a prophecy being fulfilled. Every sports broadcast in America ran the highlights. Harold Miner, slam dunk champion. The kid from Inglewood, the Trojan legend, soaring above the rim with the kind of athleticism that makes people grab the person sitting next to them and say, "Did you see that?" But here is the cruel twist that defined Harold Miner's career. The dunk contest made him famous again. It reminded casual fans that he existed. It generated exactly the kind of attention that a young franchise like Miami should have leveraged. And then the regular season resumed, and Harold Miner went right back to the bench. The victory reinforced a perception that would follow him for the rest of his professional life. Harold Miner is a dunker, a showman, an entertainer, not a starter, not a franchise player, not someone you build around. He could fly on Saturday night during All-Star Weekend, but on Tuesday night in a regular season game, the coach still did not trust him enough to play him meaningful minutes. It was a trap with no escape. The dunk contest kept the nickname alive, but calcified the image. The limited playing time prevented him from proving he was more than a highlight reel. And the longer this cycle continued, the harder it became to break out of it. Slam dunk champion. And yet, heading into his second professional season, nothing had changed. The minutes were still scarce, the opportunities still rationed. And when a new coach arrived in Miami, Harold Miner had every reason to believe his situation would finally improve. He was wrong. Coaching changes in the NBA are supposed to mean fresh starts, new philosophies, new rotations, new opportunities for players who were buried under the previous regime. When Alvin Gentry took over as head coach of the Miami Heat, Harold Miner had every reason to hope that his situation was about to change. A different voice, a different set of eyes evaluating the roster. A chance, finally, to prove that the 12th overall pick in the 1992 draft deserved real playing time. It did not happen. Under Gentry, Miner's role remained essentially the same. Limited minutes, limited touches, limited opportunities to demonstrate that he was anything more than what the dunk contest had made him in the public eye. The specifics of why are, again, difficult to pin down with certainty. But the pattern itself was damning. This was no longer one coach's decision. This was two separate coaching staffs, two different basketball minds, arriving at the same conclusion. Harold Miner, for whatever reason, was not going to be a central part of what Miami was building. Two coaches, two regimes, the same verdict. When one coach does not play you, You can argue it is a personality conflict, a philosophical mismatch, a matter of style. When two consecutive coaches reach the identical conclusion, the basketball world starts to whisper something far more damaging. Maybe the player simply is not good enough. And that whisper was devastating for a man carrying the Baby Jordan label, because the expectation attached to that nickname was not competence. It was not adequacy. It was transcendence. Harold Miner was supposed to be extraordinary. Instead, he was fighting for minutes on a team that was not even winning. The frustration must have been immense. Miner had the talent. He had proven it at Inglewood High. He had proven it at USC. He had proven it on the biggest individual stage the NBA had to offer. But proving it in a dunk contest and proving it to a coaching staff are fundamentally different challenges, and Harold Miner was losing the second battle decisively. Two coaches, the same verdict. Harold Miner was running out of chances in Miami, but the basketball gods would give him one more moment in the spotlight. One more chance to remind the world that he could fly. And this time, the stakes were even higher, because the man he had to beat had already proven he could fly too. February 1995. All-Star Weekend. Harold Miner had been here before, 2 years earlier, as a rookie, when he stunned the basketball world by winning the whole thing. Now he was back, older, more frustrated, still buried on Miami's bench, still carrying a nickname that promised the moon while his career delivered something closer to a footnote. But the dunk contest does not care about your playing time. It does not care about your coach's rotation or your minutes per game or whether the front office believes in you. The dunk contest cares about one thing only: what you can do between the free throw line and the rim, in the air, with a basketball in your hands and 20,000 people holding their breath. And the man standing between Harold Miner and a second title was no ordinary challenger. Isaiah Ryder had won the contest the previous year with a dunk so spectacular it earned its own name, the East Bay Funk Dunk. Ryder was young, fearless, and desperate to defend his crown. Beating him would not be like beating a random field of hopefuls. It would mean dethroning the reigning champion on national television. Miner did it. He defeated Ryder. He became a two-time NBA slam dunk champion, joining an extraordinarily small group of players who had ever accomplished that feat. The crowd roared. The cameras captured every angle. For a few hours on a Saturday night in February, Harold Miner was the most exciting basketball player on the planet, and the Baby Jordan label felt earned, justified, alive. But then Sunday came, and Monday, and Tuesday night, when the regular season resumed and the arena lights were not for show but for competition, Harold Miner went back to being what he had been before the contest: a bench player. A man famous for what he could do in exhibitions, but invisible in the games that actually counted. That is the tragedy compressed into a single weekend. 2 slam dunk titles, a College Player of the Year trophy, a lottery selection. And yet, within months of that second dunk contest victory, the Miami Heat would decide they had seen enough. Harold Miner was about to be shipped out of South Florida, and the destination waiting for him was far colder, in every sense of the word. After the 1994-95 season, the Miami Heat traded Harold Miner to the Cleveland Cavaliers. 3 seasons. That is how long Miami's investment in the 12th overall pick lasted. 3 seasons of limited minutes, 2 coaching regimes, 1 slam dunk title per coach, and a franchise decision that spoke louder than any press release. We do not believe this player can help us win. Cleveland in the mid-1990s was not a destination. It was a waypoint. The Cavaliers were a franchise in transition, not contending, not rebuilding with any obvious blueprint, simply existing in the middle of the Eastern Conference standings without a clear identity or a clear future. For a player desperately needing a fresh start, it was the kind of place that could go either way, a resurrection or a burial. For Miner, it became the latter. The numbers in Cleveland were devastating. 3.2 points per game, 7.2 minutes per game. Read those figures again. A former lottery pick, a two-time slam dunk champion, a player Sports Illustrated once declared the best in college basketball, averaging 3 points a night in 7 minutes of action. Those are not the statistics of a developing young player finding his footing. Those are the statistics of a man whose career is disintegrating in real time. Whether it was the accumulated effect of limited development in Miami, whether it was injuries beginning to erode his explosiveness, whether it was a roster that simply had no room for what he offered, the result was the same. Cleveland gave Harold Miner even less than Miami had. And then, in October of 1995, one of the strangest trade stories in NBA history briefly offered him an escape, before slamming the door shut in his face. October 18, 1995. The Cleveland Cavaliers and the Toronto Raptors agreed to a trade. Harold Miner would go to Toronto in exchange for Victor Alexander. The deal was announced. The paperwork was filed. For a brief window, Miner was a Raptor, a member of a brand-new expansion franchise entering just its second year of existence. A team that needed talent, needed bodies, needed players willing to compete for minutes on a roster with no established hierarchy. It could have been perfect. Toronto was a blank canvas. There were no entrenched veterans blocking his path. There was no coaching staff that had already made up its mind about him. For the first time since he left USC, Harold Miner had the possibility of walking into a situation where he could simply play basketball, not as Baby Jordan, not as a failed lottery pick, but as a 24-year-old guard trying to earn a job on an expansion team. 4 days later, the trade was rescinded. Victor Alexander failed his physical. The deal was void. Miner was sent back to Cleveland. 4 days. That is how long hope lasted. Imagine packing your bags. Imagine telling yourself this is the fresh start. Imagine mentally leaving behind a franchise that plays you 7 minutes a night, a city where your career is dying in slow motion, and then receiving a phone call that says, actually, none of that is happening. You are going back to the same bench, the same role, the same slow erasure. The trade that never was became a turning point that never happened. Miner returned to Cleveland, and the 1995-96 season ground forward, without mercy. His minutes dwindled further. His role evaporated entirely, and the calendar ticked toward a date in February that would mark the end of everything he had worked for since he was a teenager in Inglewood. By the time that night arrived, Harold Miner had appeared in only 19 games for Cleveland all season. 19 games out of a possible 60-plus. And in those 19 appearances, his minutes were so sparse that the box scores barely registered his existence. He was, in every functional sense, already gone from the NBA. The final game simply made it official. February 20th, 1996. The Cleveland Cavaliers versus the Chicago Bulls. The Bulls, Michael Jordan's Bulls. The team that was dismantling the entire league that season, steamrolling toward a record that would stand for 2 decades. The very player whose name had been attached to Miner's identity since high school was on the opposing bench, in the middle of perhaps the greatest individual season any basketball player has ever produced. Miner got 5 minutes, 5 minutes on the floor against the team led by the man he was once compared to. He did not score. He did not grab a rebound. He did not record an assist or a steal or a block. 5 minutes of nothing in a game Cleveland lost by 26 points, and that was it. Cleveland waived him shortly after. No farewell tour, no tribute video, no moment of recognition for a player who had twice won the league's premier individual showcase event. Just a transaction line in the newspaper. The kind that casual fans skip over on their way to the box scores of games that mattered. Harold Miner was 24 years old. He was a free agent, and not a single team in the NBA called. But he was not ready to accept that it was over. Not yet. There was one more door, one more opportunity, one more franchise willing to let him into a gymnasium and prove he still belonged. The following year, Harold Miner showed up at training camp for the Toronto Raptors, the same franchise that had nearly acquired him in the rescinded Victor Alexander deal, the same organization that, just 12 months earlier, had been willing to trade for him sight unseen. Now he was not arriving as a trade acquisition. He was arriving as a walk-in, an unsigned player begging for a roster spot on an expansion team that had won 21 games the previous season. Think about that trajectory. 3 years earlier, he had been a lottery pick. 2 years earlier, he had defeated the reigning dunk champion on national television. 1 year earlier, he had been a trade asset, a player with enough perceived value that 2 franchises agreed to swap him for another professional. Now, he was trying out, competing against undrafted rookies and minor league journeymen for the right to wear a uniform that belonged to the worst team in the Eastern Conference. Toronto said no. He was cut during the preseason. The details of the tryout, how many practices he attended, what the coaches saw or did not see, whether his body betrayed him or his confidence had eroded, have never been made public. All we know is the result. The Raptors released him before the regular season began, and with that decision, the last door in professional basketball closed. No other NBA team called. Not that week, not that month, not ever. At 25 years old, the man once branded as the next great flying superstar was unemployed, not by choice, not by scandal, but by the quiet, merciless arithmetic of a league that had measured him and decided he was no longer worth the gamble. Most players in his position would have looked overseas. European leagues paid well and valued athleticism. Asian leagues offered contracts to former NBA players with far less impressive resumes. There were options, not glamorous ones, but options that would have kept him on a basketball court, kept him competing, kept the dream alive in some diminished form. Miner chose none of them. He walked away from basketball entirely, and his reason reveals something about his career that no highlight reel ever showed. Years later, when he finally agreed to discuss his retirement, Miner explained that the decision was driven by the many knee injuries he had accumulated throughout his career. Not a single catastrophic blowout. Not one dramatic moment caught on camera where he crumpled to the floor and was carried off on a stretcher. Instead, it was the slow, grinding, cumulative destruction of joints that had absorbed thousands of explosive takeoffs and violent landings over more than a decade of high-level basketball. This changes the story. Not slightly, fundamentally. Go back and watch any footage of Miner in his prime. The way he attacked the rim, the height he reached, the force with which he launched himself off the hardwood. Every one of those dunks, in high school gyms, in the Los Angeles Memorial Sports Arena, in NBA arenas, in 2 nationally televised dunk showcases, came with a cost. The human knee absorbs between 4 and 7 times a person's body weight on a hard landing. For a player whose entire identity was built on elevation, That tax was being collected every single night. Now reconsider the career statistics that look so disappointing on paper. 9 points per game, 2.2 rebounds, 1.2 assists, 4 seasons. Those numbers have always been read as evidence of a player who could not make it, a flashy dunker without the complete game to survive in the professional ranks. But what if they are actually the numbers of a player whose body was failing him? What if the limited minutes were not entirely about coaching decisions or roster politics, but about a young man whose knees could no longer sustain the very thing that made him special? We do not know exactly when the injuries started. We do not know how many games he played through pain that he never disclosed. We do not know whether the coaching staffs in Miami and Cleveland were aware of the extent of the damage and chose to protect him, or whether Miner hid it because admitting weakness would have meant losing whatever minutes he still had. What we know is what he said himself, that the accumulated knee injuries made continuing impossible. The very thing that made him famous was destroying him from the inside. The dunking, the leaping, the aerial brilliance that earned him a nickname connecting him to the greatest player alive. All of it was grinding his knees into dust. And when he finally walked away from basketball, he did not just retire, he vanished. After walking away from the sport, Miner did something almost unheard of for a former NBA player. He disappeared. Not in the tabloid sense. There were no missing person reports, no dramatic exits, no public breakdowns. He simply withdrew from basketball and from public life with a completeness that bordered on total. For roughly 15 years, he gave no interviews. He made no public appearances. He attended no alumni events, no charity games, no anniversary celebrations. The basketball world, the media, the fans, the former teammates, the institutions that had profited from his name and his talent received nothing. No quotes, no updates, no forwarding address, figuratively speaking. This kind of silence is extraordinarily rare. Professional athletes, even those with short or disappointing careers, almost always maintain some connection to their sport. They coach youth leagues. They show up at old-timers' games. They do radio interviews on the anniversary of a famous play. They write memoirs. They appear on podcasts. The infrastructure of modern sports media is designed to keep former players visible, accessible, monetizable. And most of them cooperate, willingly or reluctantly, because the alternative is being forgotten entirely. Miner chose to be forgotten, or at least he chose silence over the alternative, which was answering the same question for the rest of his life. What happened? Why didn't you become what everyone said you would become? Why didn't you live up to the name? Perhaps the silence was self-preservation? When your identity has been defined since adolescence by a comparison to someone you could never equal, maybe the healthiest thing you can do is refuse to participate in the conversation. Stop explaining. Stop defending. Stop relitigating a career that ended before you were old enough to rent a car without a surcharge. Just live. Quietly. Privately. On your own terms, for the first time. Whatever the reason, the result was a void that basketball fans and media filled with their own narratives. Cautionary tale, bust, wasted potential, all-time what if. The labels multiplied in his absence because he was not there to challenge them. And then, in 2010, nearly a decade and a half after his last NBA game, something shifted. A reporter reached him, and Harold Miner, for the first time in years, agreed to talk. In 2010, Miner sat for an interview, his first significant public conversation in years. The details of what he shared were measured, careful, reflective. He was not angry. He was not bitter. He did not rage against the coaches who had limited his minutes, or the franchise that had traded him, or the league that had discarded him. Instead, he indicated something quieter and, in its own way, more powerful. A desire to begin reconnecting with USC, with acquaintances from his playing days, with the basketball life he had so completely abandoned. It was not a dramatic comeback announcement. There was no press tour, no book deal, no reality television pitch. It was simply a man in his late 30s acknowledging that perhaps the wall he had built between himself and his past did not need to be quite so high anymore. That the people and places from his basketball years were not enemies to be avoided, but connections worth revisiting. The interview signaled a thaw, and the basketball world, or at least the corner of it that still remembered what Harold Miner had once been, responded. The following year, in 2011, he appeared at the Pac-10 men's basketball tournament and was inducted into the conference's Basketball Hall of Honor. Then, on January 15, 2012, USC retired his jersey number at halftime of a game against UCLA. UCLA, the program that had always overshadowed USC basketball. The rivalry that had defined Trojan hoops as a second-tier afterthought for decades. And there, at center court, during the most emotionally charged game on the schedule, the university finally gave Harold Miner something the NBA never had: recognition. Not for what he might have become, but for what he actually accomplished. 3 seasons of brilliance. A Player of the Year honor that shook the national landscape. A legacy that, whatever happened afterward, belonged permanently to that campus. He stood at mid-court while the crowd applauded. And for once, the story was not about what went wrong. It was about what had been real. There is a difference between being remembered and being honored. Remembered is passive. It happens to you whether you want it or not, and it usually comes attached to a narrative you did not choose. Honored is active. It requires someone to stand up, organize a ceremony, print a program, hang a banner, and say out loud, "This person mattered." For most of his post-basketball life, Harold Miner had been remembered. Remembered as a cautionary tale. Remembered as a trivia answer. Remembered as the guy who could dunk, but could not stick. What he had not been for a very long time was honored. That changed in 2011 when he appeared at the Pac-10 men's basketball tournament and was inducted into the conference's Basketball Hall of Honor. It was his first significant public basketball appearance in years. A man who had avoided gymnasiums, avoided cameras, avoided the entire ecosystem of the sport, walking back into a building full of people who knew exactly who he was. The reception, by all accounts, was warm, not pitying, not condescending. Warm, the way you welcome someone home after a long trip. Then came January 15th, 2012, USC versus UCLA, the biggest game on the Trojan basketball calendar. Halftime, center court. And there, in front of thousands of fans and a national television audience, the University of Southern California retired Harold Miner's jersey number. Consider the deliberateness of that staging. USC did not choose a random mid-season game against a middling opponent. They chose UCLA, the rival, the program whose shadow had defined USC basketball for generations. They placed their greatest modern player at the center of their most important night and said, "This man's legacy belongs here, permanently, above this court, for as long as this building stands." It was not the NBA. It was not a championship ring. It was not a Hall of Fame induction in Springfield. But it may have meant more than any of those things, because it came from the place where the joy had been purest, where a young man from Inglewood had turned a football school into a basketball destination, where he had been named the best player in the country, where the nickname had felt like wings instead of chains, his jersey hanging in the rafters, his name etched into conference history. Harold Miner finally received something the professional game never offered. A tribute measured not by what he failed to become, but by what he had genuinely been. But as the full picture comes into focus, from Inglewood to USC to Miami to Cleveland to silence to this moment at center court, one enormous question still demands an answer. Whose fault was it? Who failed Harold Miner? Start with the coaches. Kevin Lottery drafted a lottery pick and barely played him. Alvin Gentry inherited that same lottery pick and reached the same conclusion. Cleveland gave him 7 minutes a night. 3 coaching staffs, 3 organizations, the same result. Either every coach who evaluated Miner was wrong, which is possible but statistically unlikely, or there was something in his professional game that did not translate from the highlights to the huddle. Was it defense? Was it half-court execution? Was it an inability to fit into structured offensive systems? We do not have a definitive answer, and Miner himself has never publicly detailed what the coaches told him behind closed doors. What we know is that the minutes never came, and without minutes, development is impossible. Now consider the injuries. The knees, the silent, grinding erosion of the joints that powered everything he did. If those injuries were present from early in his professional career, and given that he cited them as the reason for his retirement, it is reasonable to assume they were, then every evaluation of his NBA performance must be reconsidered through that lens. A player who cannot explode the way he once could is a fundamentally different player. A guard whose vertical leap has decreased by even 2 or 3 inches loses the margin that separates spectacular from ordinary. The coaches may not have been refusing to play a talented young man. They may have been watching a talented young man lose the very thing that made him talented. Then there is the era. The NBA of the early to mid-1990s was a grinding, physical, half-court league. Hand-checking was legal. Defenses were built to punish players who relied on one-on-one athleticism. The three-point revolution had not yet reshaped spacing and pace. A player like Miner, explosive, acrobatic, built for the open floor, was trying to survive in a league that rewarded size, strength, and positional discipline above all else. In a different decade, with different rules and different tempo, his skill set might have thrived. In 1993, it was a luxury most coaches could not afford to indulge. And finally, the nickname. 2 words applied to a teenager by people who meant it as the highest possible compliment. Not understanding, or not caring, that they were building a prison. Every bad game was a referendum. Every limited-minute night was proof that the comparison was fraudulent. Every box score was held up next to the man whose name he carried, and the gap between them was treated not as normal, but as failure. Was it one of these things, or all of them, compounding simultaneously, each one making the others worse? The injuries limited his ability. The limited ability reduced his minutes. The reduced minutes stunted his development. The stunted development confirmed the coach's doubts. And hovering above all of it, the nickname ensured that none of this was processed as a normal career disappointment. It was processed as the fall of a promised king. All of those factors played a role. Every single one. But there is one we have not fully reckoned with. The one that may matter more than coaching decisions, more than knee cartilage, more than the rules of a bygone era. The nickname itself. Let us talk about what those 2 words actually do to a person. Baby Jordan. Say it out loud. It sounds like a gift. It sounds like someone looked at a teenager and saw greatness so obvious, so undeniable that the only reference point sufficient to describe it was the greatest player who ever lived. What higher praise can exist? But praise and expectation are not the same thing. Praise says you are wonderful. Expectation says you must remain wonderful. And not just wonderful, but wonderful in a specific way, measured against a specific standard for the rest of your life. And when that standard is Michael Jordan, the expectation is not excellence. It is perfection. It is 6 championships. It is 5 MVP awards. It is cultural immortality. It is a level of achievement that exactly one human being in the history of the sport has ever reached. That label was placed on Harold Miner when he was 16 or 17 years old, before he had played a single college game, before he had been drafted, before he had experienced a professional practice, a road trip, a fourth-quarter collapse, a coaching change, a trade, a waiver. Before he knew anything about what the NBA would demand of him, the world had already decided what he owed them. And here is what makes the comparison uniquely destructive. It was not just about basketball skill. It was about the spectacle. Jordan did not just win, he soared. He did not just score, he created art above the rim. The nickname tied Miner not to Jordan's work ethic, or his competitiveness, or his clutch shooting, but to his aesthetic, the beauty of flight. Which meant that every time Miner dunked, the label was reinforced, and every time he did anything else, missed a jumper, turned the ball over, sat on the bench, the label was contradicted. He was trapped in a feedback loop where the only version of himself the public accepted was the airborne one. No athlete in modern sports history has carried a more paralyzing comparison for a longer stretch of his formative years. Others have been called the next somebody. Most of them shed the label quickly, either by succeeding on their own terms or by fading before the comparison could calcify. Miner never got that chance. The nickname followed him from Inglewood to USC to Miami to Cleveland to silence. It was the first thing written about him and the last thing anyone remembered. And when he finally walked away, from the sport, from the cameras, from the entire public conversation, can anyone honestly blame him? He did not just retire from basketball. He retired from being Baby Jordan. He retired from the question. He retired from the look on people's faces when they realized he was not what they had been promised. The silence makes sense now. It was not weakness. It was the only rational response to an irrational situation. Here is what is true about Harold Miner. He was born in Inglewood, California, and he could do things on a basketball court that made grown men gasp. He averaged 28 points a game as a high school senior and once put up 48 points and 17 rebounds in a single night. He went to USC and became the most celebrated player in the program's modern history. Sports Illustrated named him the best college basketball player in America, ahead of 3 future Hall of Famers. He was selected 12th overall in one of the deepest drafts ever assembled. He won the NBA's premier individual showcase event twice, defeating a reigning champion the second time. And when his body could no longer sustain the punishment, he walked away with dignity, asked for no sympathy, and lived his life on his own terms. Those are facts, not opinions, not spin, facts. Here is what is also true. His professional career lasted 4 seasons. His averages were modest. His playing time was limited. His knees betrayed him. And the nickname, the glittering, poisonous, inescapable nickname, ensured that his story would always be told as a tragedy rather than as a life. But was it a tragedy? Or was it simply a career? Not every lottery pick becomes a franchise cornerstone. Not every college superstar translates seamlessly to the professional level. Not everybody holds up under the strain of elite athletics. These are ordinary outcomes in an extraordinary profession. And the only reason Harold Miner's version is treated as something more painful, more dramatic, more laden with meaning is because someone called him Baby Jordan when he was a kid, and the world never let him be anything else. He did not fall because of scandal. He did not self-destruct. He did not become a cautionary tale about excess or recklessness or character failure. He was a gifted athlete whose body broke down and whose professional circumstances never aligned with his talent. That is not a tragedy. That is life. Difficult, unfair, and worth more than a two-word label. His jersey hangs in the rafters at USC. His name is in the Pac-10 Basketball Hall of Honor. And somewhere, the man who once flew higher than almost anyone on the planet is living quietly, privately, on his own terms. No longer Baby Jordan, no longer a cautionary tale, no longer defined by what other people expected him to be. Just Harold Miner. And that, in the end, is enough.